What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining us for another edition of the Frary Smith Podcast. It's Monday, March 4th, and we're excited to bring you episode 187 of this show. Today, we'll be breaking down the recently released Sunbelt football schedule for the 2024 season. Partner, I got to admit, normally drop on Tuesday, but the schedule came out on Friday. I felt like it was a worthwhile reason to drop this episode a day early.
Most definitely. No, I feel like us and a lot of the Sunbelt fans were on the edge of their seats for the Sunbelt schedule to come out. We know a lot of the conference realignment has kind of forced some other conferences to put their schedules out years in advance. We know some of these schedules are really far ahead of time, but the fact that the Sunbelt has now jumped on it now that we know what this season is going to look like week to week, definitely had to get into the studio, get in here early and talk about this as soon as we could.
Well, before we get to the breakdown of the 2024 schedule, I want to tell you about our last episode. Caden and I took time to draft our top 10 non-conference games in the Sun Belt. We've had some great banter on Twitter, some teams thinking that they deserve to be in that top 10. So we discuss what makes each one of those matchups great. Definitely worth taking some time to go check that out ahead of today's episode. But on today's show, we're going to be providing a complete deep dive into the upcoming 2024 Sun Belt football schedule. We'll look at some of our biggest takeaways when we first saw the schedule. We'll discuss who has maybe the easiest and the hardest schedules in the Sun Belt. We'll even break down all the Midweek Mania matchups. We'll review our top matchups heading into the month of November. It's a loaded episode, and we can't wait to get to it. But, Kato, we talked about it last Thursday when we discussed our top 10 non-conference matchups. We're getting closer and closer to the start of the season, and getting a look at this year's schedule has my excitement at an all-time high.
Yeah, mine too. No, we talked about the non-conference schedule and how exciting that was, but now being able to pair that with the conference schedule, see the order of these games, and really being able to kind of create a roadmap for each of these teams and what their season's going to look like just adds to the excitement. It makes the season feel like it's closer, even though it's not. It's not like the schedule all of a sudden accelerates us and puts us in the fall where we're getting close to these games actually happening. But I think mentally for the players, for the coaches, for us, everybody involved, the season just feels more real when you kind of can look at an entire season and know which every week of the season is going to look like.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people start to dream. I know we've already started to look at these schedules, say who could have what records at what time. Definitely creates a lot of excitement in the spring as we get set for what's going to be an electric fall season, I think. But, Kaden, we want to start with hot takes or, some big takeaways from these, schedules, some of the overarching themes of these schedules. I'm going to go ahead and go first here. I know you've got a couple. I've got another one at the end, but for me, I think my hottest take when I saw these schedules is that no team should ever have to play 4 straight road games. Thursday, October 17th, Georgia State goes to Marshall. Then they have to go to App State on the 26th of October. Then you go to UConn on November 2nd. You go to James Madison on the 9th. Caden, I think that's a crazy stretch. It comes after a stretch of pretty much 4 consecutive home games for Georgia State, but I don't think a team should ever be asked to play 4 consecutive road games.
No, I agree with that. No, I think that's part of one of the things that I have in my hottest takes or biggest takeaways from this is just looking at week 3 buys. I think they're unnecessary. And we have 4 programs, James Madison, Louisiana, ULM, and Marshall, that have buys in week 3. And it's just pointless when you look at it. And you mentioned it, it kind of sets some teams up for some tough stretches. 2 of those teams have to play 6 straight games. As a result, only 3 of those 8 games total are against FBS opponents. So I think as a former player, if you're playing 2 FCS teams to start the season and getting a bye after that, you'd much rather have that in the months of October and November when your body has much more of a toll. And I think it's just weird. I don't know what can be necessarily done about that, but I think that's just a part of the schedule that I'd like to see changed in the future, because no player, no coach is really going to get the most out of a week 3 bye compared to other weeks of the season. That'd probably be the third to last pick as far as when you could pick a bye week. And then my other takeaways, Noah, we're just looking at the schedule and us talking about teams that deserve to be on that national stage and getting their spotlight. And I think it was a huge win for Texas State being able to have 2 games on weekdays on national television, visiting Troy and hosting Louisiana. I think, like we've mentioned before, it is a struggle in the schedule playing on a weekday, but it is a privilege and you earn that. And I think they earned that last year with the season that they did have. And on the flip side, I would have liked to see Arkansas State get one of those games as well. I don't think they had as much of a major season and turnaround as Texas State did, but when you see teams like them, Southern Miss, and ULM be the only teams left off of that weekday slate. I think Arkansas State, we can agree, heading into this season has a lot more positive momentum, a lot to look forward to. I would like to see maybe a quarterback like Jalen Raynor maybe have a coming out party for this team on a national stage. So I think looking at those two teams and what they got as far as their weekday games and being on a national stage is huge. And then just a quick sidebar, I think a little small win for Georgia Southern when you look at this schedule is not having to play 4 games in the month of November. They get a month of November bye to start things off. We know they haven't been having the best month of November the last 2 seasons. So a small win for Georgia Southern, only having to play 3 games in the month of November, looking at their recent history.
Okay, now I think I have to agree with you when it comes to Arkansas State. I felt like they did enough to deserve a midweek game this year. We even saw a couple of their players get on Twitter after the announcement. They were a bit surprised that they were not getting a midweek game. I think players, like you said, it is a privilege. They look forward to those opportunities to play on national television. I think Arkansas State, you're right, deserved one. My biggest takeaway, Caden, or my second takeaway was that I think we've got some excellent Week 14 matchups this year. I think there's going to be some matchups in Week 14 that have a ton of juice. Obviously, App State, Georgia Southern, the big rivalry game, always has a ton of juice, but you get Marshall, James Madison this year. I actually thought that game was going to be a lot earlier in the season, so to get that on the final weekend of the regular season, I think is going to be an electric game. South Alabama, Texas State. We're going to talk about that one a little bit later on when we discuss our top matchups in November, so I'm not going to spoil too much, but that one could determine who wins the Sun Belt West. And again, I think, as I said, a number of these matchups could legitimately factor into some title races. So I think we've got some electric matchups in Week 14 this year in the Sun Belt. But moving on to our easiest schedules, Caden, and I got to admit, I proposed doing this, and this was probably the hardest exercise of this entire episode. And the reason why is there just aren't many easy schedules in Sunbelt football these days, with a lot of good teams in the Sunbelt East. You've got great teams as well in the Sunbelt West. But, Caden, I settled on Louisiana having my easiest schedule, and I'm going to walk you through kind of my reasoning why the Ragin' Cajuns have an easy schedule this year. I would expect them to go 2-0 to begin the year. They've got Grambling, and then you have to go to Kennesaw State, who's going to be transitioning into the FBS level this year. So I think there's a great opportunity there. Then you've got Tulane coming off that bye, which obviously is interesting. You mentioned not necessarily liking those early season bye weeks, but I do think that perhaps helps Louisiana here playing Tulane. Then you have to go on the road to Wake Forest, which obviously is not going to be an easy game. Maybe you get one of those, you're 3-1 through 5 weeks of the season, but Caden, the one thing that I like about Louisiana's schedule is that you could argue that some of their toughest games this year are going to be at home, and I think that's an advantage for Louisiana. They've got App State coming to town on October 12th. You've got Arkansas State on November 9th. You've got South Alabama on November 16th, and then the next week you've got Troy at home. They do still have to go to Coastal Carolina. You do still have to go to Texas State, and also, they don't want to hear this, but they have to go to Southern Miss, a team that they've lost 11 consecutive times to. So the road schedule isn't easy, but Caden, I think it's great to have some of the top teams visiting you in Lafayette. And like I said, there's no perfect answer to this question, but I do like the opportunity that this schedule presents for Louisiana.
I like it too, Noah, considering the youth of this team and how they're going to have to show some growth this year. And I think a good way to kind of counteract having to show growth is having some more comfort with being at home. I think the biggest question for this team, though, is how much of a home field advantage are they going to get based on some of the stadium renovations and what we've heard what's going on with that program in that regard this season. So it's definitely not an easy answer when you look at all of these schedules for these teams. The Sun Belt, like we've mentioned, is a tough conference to play in. But I think for my answer, the runaway pick was Marshall when you look at the schedule they have. They open the season up against a Stony Brook team that did not win any games last year at the FCS level. Then they play a Virginia Tech team who is going to be improved, like I mentioned before when we talked about their matchup against Old Dominion. We were talking about our favorite non-conference games, but they beat that team last year, so they should have some confidence going into that matchup. The elephant in the room is obviously playing an Ohio State team after a bye in week 4, which, look, that's a team that's probably going to be the number 1 ranked team in the nation at that point. We've seen what they've done in the transfer portal and with their coaching staff this season. And for the people that are Marshall fans that wanted us to make that at one of our top 10 non-conference matchups to look forward to this season. Just given what Ohio State should be this year and that this team lost 5 straight games last year, just could not make that matchup. But then after that, they visited a Western Michigan team that had 4 wins last year. That should be a good game for them. But then once you get into your conference schedule, rather, the East is going to be hard. And I think if you look at the teams you have to play in the East, you have to play App State, you have to play James Madison. Both of those games are going to be at home for Marshall, which is huge. And they bookend their schedule. They play App State as their first non-conference opponent, or their conference opponent rather. Then they have to go down and play James Madison to end the year. So you kind of get those games a little bit more spread out. A trip to Statesboro is never fun. You get to host Georgia State on primetime television in a very winnable game during the week. And then your cross-conference draw is Louisiana, Monroe, and Southern Miss. So if you looked at last year, those are the 2 teams you'd want to play as your cross-conference opponents if you are in the East. And then, like I mentioned before, they play 3 straight home games to end the season. The James Madison game ending things off isn't the best case scenario, but ending your season with games against Georgia, Coastal Carolina and Old Dominion, and then James Madison, a 3-game homestand. It's going to be a great opportunity, I think, when you look at this schedule front to back for this Marshall team to be able to bounce back and do what they want to do as far as getting on the right track of things compared to the season they had last year. So I think when you look at Coach Huff and this team, really excited for them just given their schedule and what the opportunities are going to have and be presented for them when you look at this season. I think their path, looking at the East, that's a tough East, is maybe the easiest path looking forward and going forward into next season.
Well, and Caden, I think to your point, this is going to be a Marshall team that has a dramatically different looking offense from everything that we're hearing. So outside of maybe that Ohio State game, I do think there is a little bit easier of an onboard into the season. You mentioned the game against Stony Brook. You mentioned Western Michigan. I think, as you said, Virginia Tech could be a winnable game. And let's be honest, that one probably could have been inside of our top 10 non-conference games. I know we've gotten some flack on Twitter for that as well, and maybe rightfully so. I think that is an interesting matchup, but I think there's an opportunity for Marshall to maybe work some things out here early on in the season, get prepared for Sun Belt Conference play, and then hopefully put together a run throughout the months of October and November, and maybe be in that title conversation midway to late into November. I think that would be huge for the Thundering Herd in 2024. Kaden, next up, toughest schedules in the Sun Belt Conference in 2024. And Kaden, I already kind of alluded to who I'm going to pick here with one of my biggest takeaways. And I had to take Georgia State, and I don't think this is much of a surprise. I touched on it early on. Georgia State has one of the weirdest schedules I've seen in a long time. They basically open the season with quote unquote 5 straight home games. You've got Georgia Tech in week 1 just down the road. That's pretty much a home game. Then you get to host Chattanooga. You've got Vanderbilt, who's kind of the doormat of the SEC, coming to Atlanta, to Center Park. And then the weird thing about this schedule, you get 2 bye weeks in the first 5 weeks of the season. So they have a bye week on September 21st. Then you've got another bye week on October 5th, and sandwiched in between that is the rivalry matchup with Georgia Southern. I think that's extremely odd. And then they get ODU on October 12th, coming off of that second bye. So I think that's a good time to have that matchup if you're Georgia State. But Kaden, then you go on the road to Marshall, to App State, to UConn, to JMU, all in successive weeks. They do get 2 home games in the last 3 to end the regular season. You've got Arkansas State in week 12. You've got Coastal in week 14. But you've also got to, play a Texas State team that could easily have 10 wins at that time of the year. Kaden, this schedule is odd. It's challenging. And with a new first-year head coach in Del McGee, I just got to say, I don't think Georgia State is set up to have an extremely successful season here with this schedule.
Yeah, there's no question the East is not easy. I'm going with the East team as well, but I think when you add in having the schedule that Georgia State has as far as their home and away games, and having a new head coach trying to reestablish the culture at a program, and just given the amount of pieces they lost last year, it's definitely going to be very challenging for this Georgia State team. For mine, I went with Old Dominion, but I wanted to give an honorable mention shout out to ULM because they have an absolute gauntlet as well. I think they have the worst 3-week stretch in the league when you look at them having to go to Texas, go to Troy, and then host James Madison after that. I mean, that's going to be rough for anybody in the conference if they're handed that or dealt that hand of cards. But just given the state of the program, that program is going to be in a tough position regardless. But when you look at Old Dominion, they have an opener against South Carolina that's going to be against an SEC opponent. We know what that entails physically, just with Sun Belt teams at large. And then they host a 2-1 Eastern Carolina team from last year, and that's should be an easier game for them. But after that, things do not get easy. They have to host Virginia Tech, which we talked about is going to be a hard-fought game. That's a series that's 1-1 right now. It should be physical, should be a great matchup, and then they get a much-needed bye after that before going into a 3-game away stretch where they have to play a Bowling Green team that won 7 games last year. They went toe-to-toe and had a 1-score loss in their bowl game to Minnesota, so that will be a good team coming out of the MAC. Then they have a trip to Coastal Carolina and a trip to Georgia State. And after being on the road for 3 straight weeks, you know what the reward is, Noah, for that? They have to come back home and they have to face Texas State. That is not ideal. That's not going to be a fun matchup for them. And then that one's followed by having a short week, having to play Thursday night the next week, going against the Georgia Southern teams. Then that offensive scheme, having less time to prepare against that, that's going to put them at a tough position as well. After that, they have to visit App State. They get a much needed bye before going into the Royal Rivalry at home, playing James Madison. Just really consecutive tough games for them. But then they close the season hosting Marshall, going to an Arkansas State team, which we think is going to be a good team to finish the season. I think that's just a good old-fashioned gauntlet. When you look at this schedule for this team, I don't think they're going to be able to really catch their breath after their first couple weeks of the season. So I think as much as I do like this Old Dominion team coming into the season, I think their schedule is going to make things hard for them and really test them and really show, are you going to be another just good team, or can you be a great team that can overcome some schedule adversity and playing some consecutive really good opponents week in and week out?
Yeah, Caden, I think those are great points. I think Old Dominion has a chance, though, in this schedule to really have some statements, some legacy-defining wins, I think, for Ricky Ronnie in this program. You're right. There are not many, off weeks in this schedule for Old Dominion. They played a lot of one-score games last year. Do they have the ability to turn those things around? We have mentioned multiple times on this podcast, too, that defense is going to be reworked. Jason Henderson, who dealt with the knee injury at the end of the 2023 season, he's expected to be back, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how he's doing as you get into this schedule. So you're right, not easy for Old Dominion as we look ahead to 2024. Kenan, one of the best things about the Sun Belt, in my opinion, are some of these midweek matchups, and we started calling it Midweek Mania. Last year we had 7 midweek games. This year we've got 8, so we add a midweek game. 11 of the 14 programs in the Sun Belt are going to have a midweek game this year. You mentioned Southern Miss, ULM, and Arkansas State, the only teams that will not have a midweek game. And honestly, Caden, I got to admit, I think this is probably the best slate of midweek games that we have seen in a long time in the Sun Belt.
No, it definitely is. No, I think it's undoubtedly the best slate of midweek games we've had in quite some time in the Sun Belt. And I remember my early days playing in the Sun Belt. We really just didn't have that many. I only remember a handful of games being played, maybe 5 or less than 5 throughout the season. And I think overall, it just speaks to the strength of the conference when you look at how many good possible matchups you can have between these teams. It's a product, or it's just a result of kind of the product we have as far as the field of teams this year, and being able to create a lot of interesting matchups both on the same side of the conference and across the conference that are just going to have a ton of storylines, a ton of appeal that they already do have right now, but we'll have more as we head into the season and really get to know what some of these teams are about.
Well, the first Midweek Mania game of 2024, it's September 19th. This is week 4. It's actually going to be the conference opener. And Caden, we've seen the conference opener in week 3 the last 2 seasons. I was honestly a bit surprised to see it wait until week 4. I thought with some of those teams that ended up getting buys that maybe we would see it in week 3. But Caden, on a midweek, I love the quarterback matchup in this one. You've got Joey Aguilar, Gio Lopez. I think that's going to be electric. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that this first midweek game, we could see 2 of the better offensive units this year. So honestly, partners, sign me up for this matchup to open Midweek Mania.
Yeah, no, South Alabama at App State, just a great opener for the conference, a great kind of showing for this league to start things off. And it really gives me vibes of that James Madison and Troy game last year. Very highly anticipated first matchup for the league that really can get people, kind of the whole conference, watching and excited about. I think, like I mentioned, it's an excellent opener, and these 2 programs are now in 2 different places. We mentioned all offseason how App State's been able to maintain their infrastructure, having both of their coordinators back, having their head coach back, having their quarterback and a lot of those pieces, especially on the offense, back, and really getting a first look at this App State team, who's probably going to be the favorite on their side of the conference, and maybe even in the entire conference this year, going up against a conference opponent for the first time. They'll be battle tested up until this point, facing Clemson already, facing facing some of those matchups they have in the non-con to start the season. And kind of on the flip side, the South Alabama team is going to have some questions to answer. You mentioned the quarterback position. You mentioned having a new head coach in Major Applewhite. And this team early on faces North Texas, Ohio, and Northwestern State. So I feel like to start the season off, we're really not going to know much about this team. And we're going to definitely learn a lot seeing them go up against who we believe is going to be probably the top team in the conference. So I think definitely an exciting matchup between two programs that were on the rise and are very different spots, but could definitely learn a lot from watching them play this early in the year.
Yeah, I think to further the point, we do expect a number of pieces for South Alabama back on offense. I do think that will probably be their best unit at the beginning of the season, with some of the wide receivers, the running back, the quarterback, and even some of the spots on the offensive line returning. But I think defense will be a question, and that's not an easy test against this App State team who basically, outside of a couple of people, Nate Noel, Deshaun Davis, bringing everyone back offensively. So tough task for South Alabama here. But Caden, there's one other nugget here, I think, as well. This comes in front of the Liberty game for App State that we have hyped up as our top non-conference matchup. So App State going to have a couple extra days to prepare for that massive matchup against Liberty. I think that bodes well for the Mountaineers. But second Midweek Mania game, Caden, this one comes in week 6, October 3rd. Troy versus Texas State in Troy, Alabama. And outside of a game we're going to talk about a little bit later on in this Midweek Mania section, Caden, this one might be my favorite midweek game of the year. Troy is the two-time defending champions. I think Texas State going into the season has legitimate hopes of being the top team in the West, maybe in the conference. G.J. Kinney, Jordan McLeod, tons of storylines. You've got Jared Parker, you've got Chris Lewis, so a lot of electric playmakers in this game. Caden, I think this game could very easily create fireworks.
It definitely could. No, I think this one just speaks for itself, and it's one of my most anticipated matchups, not just of the midweek, but the entire season. You mentioned this Troy team coming off of back-to-back championship wins and being kind of tested right now to see with a new head coach and some new pieces on both sides of the ball. Can they repeat? Can they still kind of hold that torch they've been burning for the last 2 years against who we think is probably the top contender and who my favorite is to come out of the West in Texas State after what they showed last season? This could be a game where we see Troy symbolizing that they're still here, and maybe we see Texas State symbolizing that there's a change of guard in the West. And I think one of the best parts about this matchup is both teams will be battle tested up until this point. They both face a Memphis team and a UTSA team that are both respectfully two of the best teams at the Group of 5 level. They're going to have a Power 5 opponent under their belt each. When you look at Troy visiting and playing Iowa and Texas State playing Arizona State, and they'll head into this matchup definitely having a great idea of what their rosters and teams and strengths are. And I think, like I mentioned too before, I think this is going to be an experiment that kind of tells us maybe going forward in the West, is offense or defense going to win things. We've mentioned this Troy's team's defense has kind of carried them to 2 straight Sun Belt championships the last couple of years, and this Texas State team is more predicated on that offensive attack and has some question marks on the defensive side of the ball. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what style of play and which culture kind of coming into this new era of the Sun Belt Conference is able to prevail. I'm super excited for this matchup, just given all the firepower, all the storylines, and just the matchup we're getting in this one.
Well, and Caden, could we see a Troy team that has a different looking offense this year? Jared Parker, obviously the offensive coordinator at Notre Dame. He'll be bringing more offensive prowess than maybe John Summerall, who was more of a defensive-minded head coach. So I think this matchup in Week 6 is going to be fun. But moving on to the third Midweek Mania game, it comes on October 10th, James Madison versus Coastal Carolina. And Kane, I got to admit, I don't really know what to think about this matchup. This game has been played on the last weekend of the regular season the last 2 years, and Coastal fans, plug your ears because it hasn't gone well. James Madison has won the last 2 by a combined 82 points. Last year, this was a 42-point win for James Madison. Ken, I got to be honest, I just really don't want to see a blowout on a Thursday night game, so I'm hoping this one is better than it's been the last 2 years.
Yeah, there's no question this is going to be highly motivating for this Coastal Carolina team. You mentioned the 56-14 loss last year and a 47-7 the year before that. Both of those games, there was no Grayson McCall in the picture, so you can kind of give Coastal Carolina the benefit of the doubt, but also those are just extremely lopsided losses that you never want to take, and you definitely don't want to take them on a national stage, that's for sure. So I'm sure Coastal Carolina has its matchup circled, and I think for both teams just staying on the quarterback position, we'll finally know at this point of the season going into Week 7 what the quarterback position is going to look like for both of these teams, because I think it's a huge question mark. We've mentioned Ethan Vasco on the side of things for Coastal Carolina. I think he right now going into the offseason gives them the best shot to be the team they want to be as a contender. And James Madison just replacing the consistent quarterback talent and production you had the last 2 years. There's no questions there's big shoes to fill there. So I think the quarterback position for both of these teams is going to be super key in this matchup like it always is, but they're going to be different than we've seen in the past 2 seasons, that's for sure. So definitely interested in this one and hoping that it's definitely not a blowout like we've seen traditionally in this matchup ever since James Madison joined the Sun Belt.
Well, Caden, week 8 is the only doubleheader in terms of Midweek Mania games of the season. October 15th, South Alabama versus Troy. And Caden, again, I don't want to be a downer here, but this is probably my least favorite matchup of these Midweek Mania games. And it's less about the matchup and more about the date, because I really hate that this game is on a Tuesday night. Troy has won 6 straight, 7 of the last 8 in this. And if you're South Alabama hosting this game, your biggest hope is to have, a huge, maybe a game-changing crowd behind you. But, Caden, I think it's going to be a tough draw on a Tuesday night in Mobile to have a big crowd against Troy.
Yeah, it's going to be tough for this team just looking at their recent history in this matchup and trying to get their fan base excited for it. But I think both of these teams have a lot of opportunity heading into this matchup with a couple games under their belt to maybe create and generate some excitement around this game, because the 2022 edition of this game is where we saw the most excitement in this matchup. And that's when South Alabama was hosting this game and had one of their better seasons we've seen in their school history. I think, like I've mentioned with some of these previous matchups, what excites me most about this particular edition of the Battle for the Belt is that we're going to have 2 new head coaches at the helm and 2 new quarterbacks. So I think that's going to be a huge factor, obviously, in this matchup. Like I talked about with the previous one, we'll know more about what we're getting from both of the quarterbacks and what the offenses are going to look like. The defenses the last 2 seasons have been super consistent. So I expect a low-scoring matchup, but I'm curious which team and head coach can kind of get their quarterback best ready for this matchup, and if if South Alabama rather can put themselves in a position to finally win this game after a couple of years of Gio Lopez heads into this one with confidence. And same on the flip side with Troy, can they continue their dominance in this series the way they have been with their defense and some solid play at the quarterback position as well?
Hey, well, like you've said, you get to a rivalry matchup, you can throw the records out. Obviously, recently, Troy's had a ton of success, but as you mentioned, the calculus completely different for both programs, so maybe things go better for South Alabama in 2024. But the second midweek game in that week 8, it's Marshall versus Georgia State that Thursday night, October 17th. And Caden, I think this one could have a possible electric atmosphere. These two teams have split the last 2 years. Each team has won the home game. Georgia State won by 17 in 2023, and I think Marshall could be looking for some payback heading into this matchup. I think this one could be a lot of fun on Thursday night.
Yeah, and I think there's also just added stakes to this one because these are 2 teams that kind of underachieved last year. These are both squads that went 3-5 in conference play and are going to come into the season looking to prove something. On Georgia State side's kind of prove a new culture and prove that things are going to be different for this program. And for Marshall, kind of reproving that last year was a setback for them. So I'm very curious to see in week 8, both of these teams coming off of 2 conference games apiece. It could have some early, really implications. We remember how Georgia State started off conference play last year hot. Maybe they can do that again this year and try to build on that. And same for Marshall, a team who, like I mentioned before, had those 5 straight losses that are just kind of seared into my brain as far as that being so surprising, and trying to kind of reestablish their culture, have a new offense, replace some pieces on the defensive side of the ball, and really kind of reestablish themselves this season after having a huge step back. I think they're going to have a great opportunity to do that in front of their home crowd with a nationally televised game on a weekday. So very curious to see how Marshall steps up to the spotlight and how this new Georgia State team kind of fares under a new head coach, having a new kind of their first premier game of the conference being televised on a weekday.
Yeah, I think it creates some great storylines. You mentioned the new head coach for Georgia State, obviously the new offense for Marshall. Could we see some fireworks in this midweek game? I think possibly, and so that'll obviously turn this one into perhaps a good matchup. But moving on to week 9, October 24th, Old Dominion versus Georgia Southern. And Caden, since realignment, this game has consistently been one of the better matchups in the Sun Belt. It was a 3-point Old Dominion win in Statesboro last year, a 5-point Georgia Southern win in Norfolk in 2022. But both of these teams obviously bring big offensive attacks, but I think what's been most interesting is these last 2 matchups, that hasn't necessarily materialized. We've seen the defenses play a much bigger role. Could this be maybe the year that finally changes? The last 2 meetings, as I mentioned, have been close. They've each been decided in the last 5 minutes, and I think there's another chance that a classic could be inbound here on October 24th.
Yeah, you mentioned it, Noah. When you look at what this Old Dominion team was able to do defensively last year against Georgia Southern, they did what not many other teams were able to do, holding this team to 17 points. I think the only teams that came close to doing that against this offense last year were Wisconsin in that matchup they had in the non-conference, and JMU with their dominant defense last year. So it looked like they've kind of had their number on that side of the ball, which is usually a key to success against this Georgia Southern team. So just very excited to watch those two units go up against each other. An Old Dominion defense that you mentioned has some retooling to do and some reshaping to do to kind of keep their standard high. And a Georgia Southern offense who, yet again, is going to have a different quarterback under center. Really excited to see if JC French is the guy that can maybe provide a dual threat aspect to that game. But I think what also has me excited for this matchup is both of these teams are coming off of really big games before this. You have James Madison and Georgia Southern facing off, and Texas State and Old Dominion facing off the week before that. So it's going to be very interesting to see if either of those teams can maybe pull off an upset win heading into this matchup, have some momentum. I think momentum is going to be a key for this weekday matchup against two teams that have played each other very close in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and Caden, at this time of the year, building that momentum into November, I think, is key. We saw, teams last year that maybe had some momentum falter down the stretch. You saw App State at a similar time of the year turn things around and make a run to a Sun Belt championship game. So there is a big opportunity, I think, here for both of these programs, Old Dominion and Georgia Southern, in this midweek game in Week 9. But two left in Midweek Mania: Texas State versus Louisiana, Week 10, October 29th. And Caden, you mentioned earlier on that you love Texas State getting a Thursday night game, and to top that, they're getting a Thursday night game at home, and I think this is a huge opportunity. Louisiana has obviously been one of the best teams in the West in recent years, but these are games that Texas State needs to have in order to prove that they're going to be a true contender in the Sun Belt this year. I think this is a huge opportunity for Texas State to make a statement that they've officially arrived. And on top of that, that could come on national television, which could completely help this program moving forward.
Yeah, no, and on top of that, this was one of my top 5 favorite games from last year, and I think a really underrated one. You had the 34-30 win by Louisiana at home, scoring 2 straight touchdowns to close the game out in the fourth quarter in back-to-back fashion to win that game with Zion Chris under center. Obviously, Zion is not going to be in this game for this team transferring to Houston, but I think there's no question that both of these teams remember this game very fondly last year, and the fact that Texas State is going to be able to potentially get revenge in this matchup at home on a national stage, not having to worry about the quarterback on the opposite side necessarily running all over the place. Super excited about the rematch of this matchup. And you mentioned it before. This is a Texas State team where you look at their biggest problem last year, aside from some of their defensive deficiencies, it was closing games out. And I think this game was a prime example. And they have a couple others where they just did not finish strong, and really had their 8-win season could have been potentially a 10 or 11-win season if they were able to close the deal. So I know that's going to be a point of emphasis for them this offseason. I'm sure this game alone will be a point of emphasis for them. And I'm fascinated to watch this matchup yet again kind of repeat itself as part 2 of what might be a good series moving forward in the West.
The 2024 Midweek Mania series concludes on November 7th, Week 11, Caden, and it doesn't get any better than this. Coastal Carolina versus App State. This has been one of the top matchups in the Sun Belt over the last 4 years. The last 3 games in this series have been decided by a single score. Coastal Carolina, dating back to the days that you were playing for App State, has won the last 2 games in Conway, and we remember how last year's game ended. It was a walk-off field goal for Coastal Carolina in Boone. Caden, I think this crowd in Conway, they're going to be juiced. You remember playing in front of those juiced crowds in Conway. And I think this is just an excellent way to cap off the midweek slate in 2024.
Yeah, no, this one speaks for itself, and it's one of kind of the best unofficial rivalries when you look in the conference. You mentioned this is a 4-3 record all time for App State, 2 straight wins for Coastal in their last matchup. In the last 4 years, this game has been televised. In the last 3 of those, they've been on weekday games. So I think this is one nationally that people are always excited about, because the animosity has really been there since 2020 when Coastal got their first win of this series. I remember that one vividly. That was when Coastal was kind of turning the page and established themselves as a power in the Sun Belt. And moving forward, these games have just been absolute dogfights year in and year out. You see some chirping on social media between the fan bases, maybe even the players sometimes in the history of this game. And I think putting it at this late in the season with a lot of anticipation, given how great it was last year early in the season, I think when you look at both seasons for both of these teams as well last year, if you played this game at this point, things would be a lot different. You'd have a different quarterback under center for this Coastal Carolina team. This App State team finally got its rhythm to close out the year. So I think now that both of those things will definitely fully play out this year, having this game so late in the season, have my popcorn ready and my App State gear ready for this one for sure, watching this one when it comes down to week 11 of the season.
Hey, this is one game a year, Caden, that it's completely okay for you to wear your App State gear. You've played in this game, you've won this game, you've lost this game. So this is a huge matchup to round out Midweek Mania. But as we said, one of the best Midweek Mania slates of games that we have seen in quite some time in the Sun Belt. Caden, moving on to our next section, and that's the top 5 November matchups. One special caveat, we did go ahead and exclude the Coastal Carolina App State game that we talked about in our last segment. But Caden, let's go first to fifth here. You and I talked about this. We tried to, create a good order here of some games that you and I are excited about in the month of November. And Caden, we'll start with the game that if there is a game to get your popcorn ready for, it's the budding rivalry in the Sun Belt. It's App State versus James Madison. It will be for the second year in a row in that penultimate week of the season. And Caden, preseason, James Madison and App State, they are going to be, two of the preseason favorites to come out of that Sun Belt East. Could this game ultimately decide the Sun Belt East? I think there's a chance of that. There's going to be a ton of star power in this game. This matchup is going to be sold out. We've talked about it becoming the new IT rivalry in the Sun Belt East. And Caden, there's no way, given everything I just said, that this was not the most anticipated matchup come November this year.
Yeah, there's no doubt it's the IT rivalry, and I want to give a shout out to Twitter for maybe giving some potential names for this rivalry. I saw a lot of great ones, the Summit Series, maybe the Blue Ridge Brawl. There was just a lot of good ones, and I can't wait to have that continue to be established through the lore of this matchup. You mentioned last year kind of gets as big as it gets with this game hosting College Game Day on James Madison's campus, going into overtime, and App State pulling off a dramatic win and just really kind of evens the series at 1-1 the last couple of years, which has been one of the best matchups you see in the conference. You mentioned all the storylines, and the game just is really going to speak for itself. These are two teams who are going to, it seems like for a long time in this conference, vie for that spot in the East to get through the championship game. We always used to say on the mountain that the App State or the Sun Belt Championship goes through Boone. And I think in the last couple of years with these additions of new teams to the conference, James Madison is going to have something to say about that for sure in the conference championship game going through them as well. So I think it's not ridiculous to say that this could decide the East moving forward, not just this year and years in the future. And I couldn't be more excited about this matchup. I think it could have the potential if both of these teams have really strong starts to the year to maybe have some College Game Day potential again, some of that best group of 5 magic when you talk about this season and the implications, maybe even expanding to the college football playoff. So the stakes for this one can only go up, I think, between now and then, but just on paper right now, definitely one of the most exciting matchups throughout the entire season, and it being in the month of November only ups those stakes. It's going to be cold in Boone, North Carolina when this one comes around.
Yeah, I got to admit, I've already thought about maybe trying to go to this one, but the potential temperature up there in Boone has me shying away a little bit, but we'll see how the season plays out. Caden, November 30th, the last weekend of the year, we get to see a game that I think you and I are both excited about. Texas State at South Alabama. And I legitimately believe that South Alabama and Texas State are two of the top title threats in the Sun Belt West this year. Obviously, don't discount Troy, but Caden, I don't think it's a stretch to say that this game could decide who's representing the West in the Sun Belt Championship that following week on December 7th. I think this game will most likely be on national television. It could be an electric atmosphere as both teams perhaps vie for their first ever Sun Belt Championship. You could have 2 elite quarterbacks in this matchup, so sign me up.
Yeah, no, this is a great one as well. And I think when you talk about the West implications, both of these teams would have had already played Troy in the season. So if either one of those teams can get a win over Troy that they have not been able to get in the last couple seasons, this will definitely have huge implications looking at the West title race. And I think even that aside, when you look at this matchup last year, I don't know if you remember, Noah, but this was an absolute shootout. You had Texas State winning this one 52-44. We saw Carter Bradley throw for 2 touchdowns before suffering an injury, and Desmond Trotter coming in and throwing 4 touchdowns for Troy. So I think Gio Lopez, you expect big things for him in this offense this season, maybe adding that element of his legs as well. And we know what the pedigree, the quarterback position is about to be at Texas State with Jordan McLeod under center and what that offense is capable of. So I would not mind seeing another shootout in this one, that's for sure, to close out the year and be towards the end of the season. But I think you mentioned and add those West implications as both of these teams will be vying for that spot. Definitely an elite matchup that I can't wait to see.
Well, and Caden, we said it last year when we talked about this matchup. Interesting nugget. The home team has won every meeting in this matchup. So perhaps advantage South Alabama heading into this final game of the regular season. But November 16th, we'll take a few weeks of a step back. Old Dominion versus James Madison, Caden, the royal rivalry. And this was one of the Sun Belt's best games a year ago. JMU wins it by 3 to preserve their undefeated season at the time. The royal rivalry aspect obviously makes this, very juicy, plenty of juice. And Kane, I said it earlier, I think Old Dominion's going to have a couple chances this year to get a legacy-defining win for Ricky Ronnie and this team. And I think this is one of those opportunities. JMU could be trying to stay in the title race at this time of the year. And let's be honest, partner, who doesn't enjoy a good rivalry football game in the month of November?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those matchups that's going to slowly but surely turn into ones where the records don't matter, because we saw that last year. This was a James Madison team that was ranked 25, and after this loss, Old Dominion was 4-4, but they did not flinch at all. You would have thought if you just took the logos off of the helmet, these were two of the conference's top teams going up against each other, and I think that just speaks to the character of this Old Dominion team. I mentioned it in the preseason rankings that got a lot of buzz from James Madison fans. This Old Dominion team is coming into the season with more consistency through their coaching staff and through their roster, so very curious to see how they're going to be able to match up against this James Madison team. By this point of the season, we'll know a lot about both teams. But like I mentioned before, this might be one of those ones where it doesn't matter the records of either team. Even if Old Dominion, like their tough schedule, as I mentioned before, takes some losses this year, I think they will have a lot of joy in spoiling a potential good James Madison season and being able to get a win over a rival like that within the state. So this one's going to be, I think, worth the price of admission every year after this. And I think this might be the epitome of this matchup going forward, just looking at what James Madison has lost, what Old Dominion is keeping, and it kind of culminating in a potential race in the East when you look at the end of the year in the month of November.
Well, our fourth favorite matchup in the month of November comes on November 23rd, Louisiana versus Troy. And Kane, to me, this is a super interesting matchup because there's nearly identical records all time between these two. Louisiana holds a slight advantage, 13-11. Troy, though, won in both years under John Summerall. But then you look back even further, the two previous years under Billy Napier, Louisiana won this game. This is one of the longest standing series in the Sun Belt, dating all the way back to 1946. Wow. So, Kaden, this is another matchup that I think has a real chance to have huge title implications come late November.
Yeah, it could. I feel like Louisiana's kind of the sleeper team when you look at the West this year. Obviously, Troy has earned their right as one of the favorites, if not the favorite, with the past two championships under their belt. But this is a Louisiana team that not too long ago was winning a championship as well. And when you look at what they bring back this year with a young roster, having more experience under their belt, really excited for them this year. And when you look at last year's matchup, people might forget that this Louisiana team really gave Troy a run for their money better than a lot of teams. It was a 7-point loss, 31-24. Chandler Fields threw for 3 touchdowns in this game. We expect him to be the starter again. So he had some success against a Troy defense that not necessarily a lot of teams had any success at all against. So I'm really excited for this matchup with both of these teams kind of having to go back to the drawing board, figure some things out with their roster. And their level of confidence going to the month of November, I think, will definitely be huge because I think both of these teams, as you mentioned before, are going to be tested.
Our last matchup, Caden, here for the month of November that you and I have our eyes on, and obviously caveat by saying there's plenty of excellent matchups in the month of November. These were just some of the ones that you and I liked. But November 23rd, Coastal Carolina versus Georgia Southern. Caden, when you look at this matchup, Coastal had a 3-game winning streak snapped last year. It was an immaculate atmosphere in Statesboro, the largest crowd in Paulson Stadium history. Georgia Southern forcing Grayson McCall to throw a career-high 4 interceptions in this matchup. And ultimately, Georgia Southern wins this game by 10. It was their first win since a triple overtime thriller back in 2019. And Caden, I'm expecting to see some similar juice in this game as it makes its transition to Conway here in 2024.
Yeah, I think when you look at the Sun Belt East as a whole, it's going to be one of those competitive divisions for a very long time, just because I think a lot of these teams have the ability to kind of go tick for tack, game for game. And I think these two teams are a perfect epitome of that. When you look at this Old Dominion and Coastal team, I feel like any given year, you're going to see one team get the edge over the other. Obviously, the Georgia Southern team snapping that win streak, having that career defensive game for them and forcing more turnovers than we've ever seen them force within a season kind of gives them bragging rights for a year. But I think heading into this season, the odds are going to be even with the home and away, flipping the script on this one, having both teams having to figure out some things at the quarterback position. So I think this is just going to be a classic Sun Belt East rivalry game that we're just going to be able to continue leaning on year after year after year, just because both of these teams are going to be competing, I think, at a high level for many years to come. And I think them being on a national stage is just going to bring out the best of both of these teams when we see them square off.
Well, Caden, they say it up in Boone. We say it on this podcast. You're remembered for your November. And I think some of these games certainly will go a long way to how a lot of these teams are defined in 2024. So certainly has the opportunity to be one of the more exciting November slates in recent Sun Belt Conference history. But Caden, moving on, we wanted to break down some schedules for some of the East top teams. We're going to do it for the West as well. So let's start with App State, who we both believe is going to be the preseason favorite heading into 2024. I do have to admit, though, after looking at this App State schedule, there is a tough road to getting to that Sun Belt championship game. But Caden, you're going to talk about it in a minute. I think that this schedule for App State that has some great matchups in the non-conference gives them a legitimate opportunity to get into the college football playoff if they're able to handle it.
Yeah, I think when you look at the group of 5 level moving forward and having that one spot to get into the 12-team playoff, if you do have a difficult schedule, you can be very much rewarded by playing well in that schedule and within your conference. And I think this App State team has a path to the playoff, and they have really big non-conference opportunities. I've always felt like the schedule for this team was stacked a little bit differently with the home and away splits, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when you have a team like Clemson on your schedule in week 2, that's a huge game. And even if they do not win that game, if they are able to win that game, that'll obviously make them early favorites to make that playoff and be the best group of 5 team. But even if they can play that Clemson team well, that team can stay ranked throughout the season and do what they normally do, playing in ACC championship games and getting double-digit wins. That'll be huge. You mentioned their game against Liberty that we've tabbed as the best non-conference game heading into the year for the Sun Belt Conference. If they can get a win over last year's team that made it to the Cotton Bowl and play Clemson even close, I think that really sets this team up for success moving forward in the season. But when you talk about the home-away games for this team, as you mentioned, a trip to Statesboro is never fun. A trip to Conway is never fun. And a trip to Marshall is never fun. And you kind of have to flip-flop that year for year for this team. But with Marshall coming off of more of a down year, that's great news for them. And the other great news for them is that they host James Madison this season, coming off of the game they had last year in Harrisonburg. So I think when you look at this team, they have a path to make it not only to the conference championship game, but maybe get some national recognition and maybe be vying for that college football playoff spot. They have a tough crossover slate as well when you look at having to go to Louisiana to play a game of opponent that's given them trouble throughout the years, who they lost the Sun Belt Championship to in a couple years ago, and looking as well playing South Alabama, one of those midweek games we're really having an eye on and really looking forward to. I think this team is going to be battle tested throughout the year, and if they're able to come out on top in a lot of these games, I think they'll have a huge opportunity to be the West or the group of 5 representative when you look at the 12-team playoff here coming up.
Caden, I think if there's one thing, though, that concerns me, I think it's both a blessing and maybe perhaps a curse for this App State team, is they are going to have a couple of late season buys. So it's a blessing because you're playing a really tough schedule to begin the year. You've got the game at Clemson you mentioned, then you've got ECU on the road, you've got South Alabama and Liberty. That all comes in the span of 4 weeks, but then you've got, the bye in late October or mid-October rather, and then you've got another bye coming up in November. So I think, if App State's rolling by that time, obviously it's a little bit tougher to continue to play well coming off of those byes. So I think that's a challenge. But then you mentioned it, you've got James Madison at home in the penultimate week of the regular season. I think that's going to be a juicy matchup that could very easily be the deciding game in the Sun Belt East come November. And then obviously, everyone knows about the rivalry game between Georgia Southern and App State. And if you don't know too much about that, I don't know what rock you've been living under, but we did talk about that on a recent episode, dubbing it the number 1 rivalry in the Sun Belt. That ends the season. So I think this is a challenging schedule for App State. They have the pieces returning to play well in this schedule. But Caden, as we've both said, this is no easy road to getting back to that Sun Belt championship game, maybe trying to win that and securing that spot in a group or in a college football playoff come the month of December. But James Madison, Caden, when you look at their schedule this year, I think this is at least an 8-win football team, but they have a much higher ceiling than that. Obviously, had a huge year last year. You've got a chance to make a lot of noise in the non-conference stretch, and I do like a number of their home games. Southern Miss, Georgia State, I think are extremely winnable games. So sign me up for James Madison once again being amongst the elites in the Sun Belt East in 2024.
Yeah, the same way I mentioned for App State, there is a path as well for James Madison to be that representative, the group of 5 representative in the college football playoff. I think that path's a little bit easier than App State's path works to their advantage, but at the same time, you have to get some of those big wins as well. I love them getting their first 4 non-conference games out of the way early, especially with the new coaching staff, kind of having some leeway there as far as being able to figure out your own team, your own roster, and your recipe for winning, starting off their season against Charlotte, facing Gardner-Webb after that, having a bye week, and then having a big opportunity to go to Chapel Hill and get a win against North Carolina. I think that would look great on their resume and in regards to the entire schedule. You follow that well up with a game against Ball State, and then you look at them starting off conference play against Louisiana Monroe, and one of the other pros of their schedule at large is their crossover games. You have to play Louisiana Monroe, you have to play Southern Miss, two teams you would love to play in the East as far as going to your crossover matchups. But I think the cons of their schedule and some of the difficulty they will face is just being one of the few teams that has to play 6 straight games. You mentioned the week 3 bye comes with 3 straight games after that. Yeah. They have a back-to-back away series with App State in the Royal Rivalry. So I think those 2 weeks are really going to test this team. But outside of those 2 things, I think this team is built for. And I think just like App State, I think one of these App State or James Madison is going to be in a position to really supplant themselves as a ranked team, one of the better group of 5 teams in the nation, trying to vie for that one playoff spot. And I think when you look at James Madison's path, you can maybe argue they have an easier way to get to that. And given their cachet of last season as well, being a national storyline, being a ranked team, I think that'll also help them as well. So I'm excited for James Madison. I think they definitely have a path of being kind of crowned that group of 5 champion when we're all said and done and the month of November is over.
Well, and Caden, I think, you did bring up an interesting point there when it comes to the front half of this James Madison schedule. There's obviously going to be a lot of new pieces in Harrisonburg, new head coach, and I do think it gives you a little bit of an on-ramp into the season. You could make or break your chances, I think, at getting to that college football playoff if you're James Madison, but it doesn't hurt you in the Sun Belt title race. And Kaden, I think you also talked about it there at the end. This is an extremely challenging schedule for James Madison come the month of November. You've got Georgia State at home, then you have to go to Old Dominion and App State on back-to-back weeks before welcoming Marshall to end the regular season. So if you can use that non-conference stretch to get yourself into a great position, maybe you come out of that 3-1, maybe 4-0 if you're able to beat North Carolina, and then you've prepared yourself for a good November, Caden. I think you're right. I don't see any reason why James Madison is not in the conversation to both be ranked and be perhaps that group of 5 champion and the representative in the college football playoff in 2024. Moving on to the Sun Belt West, Caden, it's worth talking about Troy here first because they're the 2-time defending champions, but there's a lot of changes in the calculus in Troy, Alabama. New head coach, number of players from last year's rosters that have been staples for the previous years will not be here, but you can't discount Troy until they prove otherwise, and I think that they will show us that they're probably still a force to be reckoned with in 2024.
Yeah, and like I mentioned with James Madison, the front of their schedule actually has a lot of similarities. They're both getting their first 4 non-conference games out of the way with a new head coach, with a new staff, and some new pieces. So they'll have some time to figure things out as well. And they both dip their toe into conference play and get things started off against ULM, which I think is a coach's dream as far as trying to get some momentum before your biggest games of the year. But I think the difference is with this Troy team is they're going to be a little bit more battle tested, I think, heading into their season. You mentioned the Iowa game, going to Iowa, a team that was in the Big Ten championship last year, is going to be a physical matchup and really test this team. Having Memphis in their non-conference schedule as well, a 10-win team from last year, that's perennially one of the best teams in the group of 5. And I think after that, dipping your toe in the ULM game, like I mentioned, you get things really on and popping, hosting Texas State in that weekday game. And I really like that they have back-to-back weekday games that are separated with a bye. I think as a player, when you kind of have that weekday game randomly thrown in there, it kind of throws some things off, but kind of being able to be on that same schedule with a bye week between will really prepare this team that has that championship pedigree and knows what they're doing as far as handling a schedule. I think they're going to be set up for success. And as you mentioned with the crossover games, trips to Statesboro are never easy, but you're hosting Coastal Carolina, which is a win. But I think ultimately you look at the rest of their schedule and you face a lot of West teams that you've quite frankly owned the last 2 years when you look at your conference schedule, what you've been able to do to make it to that championship game. So I think early on with the battle testedness of this team combined with the kind of the order of their schedule, this Troy team will probably be a confident group. And I think they'll really be set up for success and going and vying to make it to that conference championship game. And in their mind, probably winning it again.
Well, and Caden, the one thing that we have seen from Troy teams in the last couple of years, albeit different players, different staff, is they've had the ability to lose a couple of games early on in the year, use those as fuel to figure things out so that they're playing their best football down the stretch. But Caden, you mentioned it with the Memphis game, the Iowa game. I think the one thing that has me most excited about this Troy schedule is there is a real opportunity here to make some early noise. You've got Memphis, who I think is a team that if you and I had to pick 10 teams right now that were maybe in the running for that group of 5 spot in the college football playoff, Memphis would be one of those. We've all joked in this industry about the offense that is Iowa. Could it look different in 2024? Perhaps, but I think that's a very winnable Power 5 game if you're able to put together some nice performances. And Kane, like you said, you've got some favorable West matchups here. Yes, you have to go to Louisiana, but that's a game that Troy's been able to win over the last couple of years. You end the slate with Southern Miss at home. So this schedule is set up nicely for Troy to perhaps, make some noise. You mentioned the midweek games and the bye in between. So I like the schedule for Troy. I think they're going to need to get off to a fast start this year. And if they do, they are going to be a team that we are talking about all year long as a potential group of 5 representative in the college football playoff. But Caden, Texas State is a team that I know you and I are extremely high on as we start to look ahead to 2024. I think you might even be able to say, and I don't expect it to play out this way in the preseason polling, but I think Texas State is the preseason favorite now in the Sun Belt West with the additions of Jordan McLeod, obviously a number of pieces back. I think the questions on defense definitely still hold me back from dubbing them that preseason favorite wholeheartedly. But Caden, when you look at this schedule, there's a couple of midweek games. They've got an extremely favorable stretch to begin the year with a big game against UTSA that I think they could win, a game against Arizona State that they should be favored, and then a neutral game against Sam Houston State. They're basically playing, 4 straight home games to begin the year. So I think this is a huge opportunity for G.J. Kinney and Texas State to make a lot of noise and prove that they rightfully deserve to be in that title race in the Sun Belt West come this fall.
Yeah, no, ever since their season ended last year, this was the team that was my favorite to come out of the West, and I'll continue to stand on that throughout the season. And they have a great opportunity to make some noise when you look at this schedule. You could enter conference play with a respectable group of 5 win, as you mentioned, against UTSA, maybe a less respectable but solid Power 5 win against Arizona State that could be beneficial to them long term when you look at the big picture of this thing. But I love that their conference or schedule is bookended by Troy and South Alabama at the top and bottom. Those are probably going to be 2 of their tougher matchups, and getting one out of the way early and having some time to kind of develop and find your way before playing that potentially big one at the end of the season, I think is going to be huge for them. They have manageable cross-conference games going up against Georgia State and Old Dominion. I think they're going to be able to win that. But overall, it is a very balanced schedule. There aren't very scary stretches when you look at some of these teams that we see across the conference that have just gauntlets maybe for 2 or 3 week stretches. Not really the case for Texas State. And you start that off, like you mentioned, playing a lot of games in the state of Texas to start the season. You can maybe look at their stretch where they play during the week against Troy, they host Arkansas State, and go to Old Dominion as maybe their toughest 3-week schedule slate. But I think when you look overall, this team has a huge opportunity to live up to some of the hype that I and other people are giving them throughout the season when you look at their schedule. So I'm pumped to see them get after it. They have a ton of key games that are going to be looked at as very high important games for this program really going forward. But I think they're so spread out and evenly distributed that this team's going to really be able to navigate the schedule with ease, especially given their quarterback at the helm now that's super experienced.
Well, Caden, I think for everything you just said, I think that this is a Texas State team that come November could be chasing 10 wins. And like you said, their November, I think, is set up very nicely. Yes, they have to go to ULM, but then you've got home games against Southern Miss and Georgia State. You go to South Alabama at the end of the year in a game that, perhaps could determine who wins the Sun Belt West. So I think things are set up for Texas State. If they do their work early on, they're going to be riding some momentum into that first conference game against Troy that obviously will be on national television. So, Caden, like you said, I feel good about Texas State's chances. If they can fix, and plug some of those holes defensively, I think this is a Texas State team that has a chance to dethrone Troy in the Sun Belt West and maybe even give App State a run or JMU a run for their money in that Sun Belt championship game. But that will do it for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed our breakdown of the 2024 Sun Belt football schedule. Before you go, we did want to tell you a little bit about our upcoming schedule. Caden's fixing to move to Nashville in the weeks ahead. I'm calling multiple conference tournaments, including the Sun Belt tournament that begins tomorrow. And because of that, Caden and I, we're going to be taking a 2-week break from the show. We will be back on the airways on Tuesday, March 19th. So we certainly look forward to being back and talking some more Sun Belt football as we get set to dig into the remainder of the offseason. But that'll do it for us here at the Frary Smith Podcast. Before you go, here's all we ask. Keep telling your friends about the show, and while you're at it, take a moment to subscribe on YouTube. We can't wait to continue growing with you. So for Caden Smith, Richmond Weaver, and Brett Jemis, I'm Noah Frary. We really appreciate you spending more time with us today. We'll talk to you again in a few weeks.